Death and rebirth. What did the Buddha teach about the cycle of rebirth? What does it mean to comprehend birth as an instance of suffering? And what is accomplished by viewing it in that way? The Buddha often compared all suffering to the acts of clinging and feeding, acts inherently stressful not only for those clung to and fed upon, but also for those who, through the disease of hunger, Dhammapada 203, keep needing to cling and feed. In fact, for the Buddha, feeding and clinging are virtually one and the same. The Pali word for clinging, upadana, also means fuel or sustenance and the act of taking sustenance from fuel. In his explanation of how a fire burns, for instance, the fire feeds itself by clinging to its fuel, an image he also used to illustrate how rebirth happens through the process of clinging to craving. But, Master Gautama, at the moment a flame is being swept on by the wind and goes a far distance, what do you designate as its clinging sustenance then? Vacha, when a flame is being swept on by the wind and goes a far distance, I designate it as wind-sustained, for the wind is its clinging sustenance at that time. And at the moment when a being sets this body aside and is not yet born in another body, what do you designate as its clinging sustenance then? Vacha, when a being sets this body aside and is not yet born in another body, I designate it as craving sustained, for craving is its clinging sustenance at that time. Samyutta Nikaya SN 44.9, Kutuhalasala Sutta with Vachagata. What is a being in Buddha's teachings on rebirth? By introducing a being into this passage, the Buddha might be suspected of introducing a what into his discussion of birth. And this is not the only place where he talks about a being to be born in this context. Monks, the descent of the embryo occurs with the union of three things. There is the case where there is no union of the mother and father, the mother is not in her season, and a gandhava, the being to be born, is not present, nor is there a descent of an embryo. There is the case where there is a union of the mother and father, and the mother is in her season, but a gandhava is not present, nor is there a descent of an embryo. But when there is a union of the mother and father, the mother is in her season and a gandhava is present. Then with this union of three things, the descent of the embryo occurs. MN 38. However, on the level of dependent co-arising, the Buddha did not treat the concept of a being as a what. His definition of a being shows that he recommended that it too be regarded as a process. As he was sitting there, Venerada said to the Blessed One, "A being, Lord, a being," it said. To what extent is one said to be a being? Any desire, passion, delight, or craving for form, radha. When one is caught up, satta there, tied up, visada there, one is said to be a being satta. Any desire, passion, delight, or craving for feeling, perception, fabrications. Any desire, passion, delight, or craving for consciousness, radha. When one is caught up there, tied up there, one is said to be a being. SN 23.2. So the Buddha advocated viewing a being simply as a process of attachment to desire, passion, delight, and craving. A being in this sense can take birth, die, and be reborn many times in the course of a day, as attachment develops for one desire, ends and then develops for another one, to say nothing of how often it occurs during the lifetime of a physical body. This is why the processes leading to rebirth can be observed and redirected in the present moment, For, as we have already noted, the mental processes that move from moment to moment on the micro level are identical with the mental processes that move from body to body on the macro level. Once born on either the micro or the macro level, the being process is maintained by the four nutriments of consciousness: physical food, sensory contact, sensory consciousness, and the intentions of the mind. Where there is passion, delight, and craving for the nutriment of physical food, consciousness lands there and increases. Where consciousness lands and increases, there is the alighting of name and form. Where there is the alighting of name and form, there is the growth of fabrications. Where there is the growth of fabrications, there is the production of renewed becoming in the future. Where there is the production of renewed becoming in the future, there is future birth, aging, and death together, I tell you, with sorrow, affliction, and despair. Similarly with the nutriment of sensory contact, the nutriment of intellectual intention, and the nutriment of sensory consciousness. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 12, Ati Raga Sutta. Where there is passion, there is a complex relationship between craving and nutriment in sustaining this process. On the one hand, as the above passage shows, craving has to be actively present before consciousness will land on any of the forms of nutriment. On the other hand, had there been no past craving, none of these forms of nutriment would even exist. These four nutriments have craving as their cause, craving as their origination, are born from craving, are brought into being from craving. Majjhima Nikaya, MN 38, Maha-nidana, Sutta, the Greater Craving Destruction Discourse. What role does name and form play in the cycle of birth and death? This means that craving produces the food that it then feeds on, a fact that allows for the processes leading to birth to lead to repeated rebirth. The role of craving here is closely connected with that of consciousness, which, like craving, produces the food on which it feeds. Because these processes are self-sustaining, any attempt to map them has to be complex. One of the primary complaints about dependent co-arising is that it is overwhelmingly complicated. This, however, is like complaining about the complexity of a city map that shows all the streets. You put up with the complexity so that you can find precisely the street you want. In the same way, once you accept the fact that the processes leading to suffering are complex, you appreciate the usefulness of the maps provided by dependent co-arising. They point out precisely where in the processes you can make a difference, so that causal patterns can be directed away from suffering and toward its end. We can see this clearly in the way the two prime models of dependent co-arising depict the self-sustaining pattern by which consciousness produces the food on which consciousness can then continue to feed. This pattern is most obvious in the model that traces the causes of birth back to a mutual causality between consciousness on the one hand and name and form, the mental and physical dimensions of experience, on the other. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form, thus it has been said, and this is the way to understand how, from consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. If consciousness were not to descend into the mother's womb, would name and form, the mind and body of the fetus, take shape in the womb? No, Lord. If, after descending into the womb, consciousness were to depart, would name and form be produced for this world? No, Lord. If the consciousness of the young boy or girl were to be cut off, would name and form ripen, grow, and reach maturity? No, Lord. Thus, this is a cause, this is a reason, this is an origination, this is a requisite condition for name and form, that is, consciousness. Diga, Nikaya. 15. Maha-nidana Sutta, the Great Causes Discourse. In playing a part in the process of birth and growth, consciousness also depends on the phenomena it sustains. If consciousness were not to gain a foothold in name and form, would a coming into play of the origination of birth, aging, death, and stress in the future be discerned? No, Lord. Thus, this is a cause, this is a reason, this is an origination, this is a requisite condition for consciousness, that is, name and form. Digha Nikaya. 15. Maha-nidana Sutta, the Great Causes Discourse. In this way, consciousness directly feeds the factors that it, in turn, feeds upon. So this model for mapping dependent co-arising focuses on one place to break the sequence, the mutual dependence between consciousness and name and form. Vinsariputta. It's as if two sheaves of reeds were to stand leaning against one another. In the same way, from name and form as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. If one were to pull away one of those sheaves of reeds, the other would fall. If one were to pull away the other, the first one would fall. In the same way, from the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness comes the cessation of name and form. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 12.67, Nalakalapio Sutta, Sheaves of Reeds. What role does consciousness play in the cycle of rebirth? The more standard model for dependent co-arising gives a more precise picture of what it means to pull away consciousness and name and form. This model, whose factors we listed in the preceding chapter, traces the causes of suffering back to ignorance, and in so doing provides a more complex picture of the way in which consciousness produces its own food. At first glance, the pattern of a self-sustaining consciousness process is less obvious in this model because consciousness appears as a factor only once. However, it functions as a sub-factor at two other points in the process, where it feeds off the factors it sustains. Because the picture here is more complex, it's more explicit in showing where to focus your attempts to deprive the process of food. Consciousness first appears in the process as the factor of consciousness itself. This factor follows on ignorance and fabrication and acts as the condition for name and form. The fact that consciousness occurs immediately after fabrication emphasizes that it is driven by intention. As SN 22.79 notes, the element of intention is what turns the potential for sensory consciousness into an actual experience of sensory consciousness. For the sake of consciousnesshood, fabrications fabricate consciousness as a fabricated thing. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 22.79, Kajaniya Sutta, chewed up. Thus, every act of sensory consciousness is purposeful. As long as ignorance drives fabrication, there is no such thing as a totally passive or pure state of consciousness. Every act of consciousness is colored by the intentional element that shapes it. The fact that the factor of consciousness appears before name and form emphasizes the fact that consciousness has to be present for all the remaining factors, including intention under name, to occur. And because both consciousness and name and form depend on fabrication, which in turn depends on ignorance of the stressful nature of fabrication, this model shows that one way to deprive the consciousness process of food is to develop right view about the intentional element of fabrication underlying that process. The second point where consciousness appears in the process of dependent co-arising is as a component of the factor of contact at the six senses. Its role here carries over from its dependence on fabrication, emphasizing the fact that sensory contact is never purely passive. Even the barest contact already contains an element of intentional fabrication that colors it with ignorance. It's in dependence on a pair that consciousness comes into play. And how does consciousness come into play in dependence on a pair? In dependence on the I and forms there arises I consciousness. The I is inconstant, changeable, of a nature to become otherwise. Forms are inconstant, changeable, of a nature to become otherwise. Thus, this pair is both wavering and fluctuating, inconstant, changeable, of a nature to become otherwise. I consciousness is inconstant, changeable, of a nature to become otherwise. Whatever is the cause, the requisite condition for the arising of I consciousness that is inconstant, changeable, of a nature to become otherwise. Having arisen in dependence on an inconstant factor, how could I consciousness be constant? The coming together, the meeting, the convergence of these three phenomena is eye contact. Similarly with ear, nose, tongue, body, and intellect consciousness. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 35.93, Dvaya Sutta, a pair. What this shows is that to starve the consciousness process of food, you have to focus less on how you react to sensory contact and more on what you bring to sensory contact, the habits of ignorant fabrication that shape what you sense. At the third point in the series, consciousness together with its nutriment plays the role of feeding and clinging, building on craving and leading to becoming, a sense of one's identity in a particular world of experience, which is the prerequisite for birth. Think of the way in which, when you fall asleep, a dream world appears in the mind, and you then enter into that world. In this case, the Buddha said, consciousness plays the role of a seed that, when watered by craving and delight, blooms into becoming on the level of sensuality, form, or formlessness. Karma is the field, consciousness, the seed, and craving the moisture. The consciousness of living beings hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving is established in a lower property, the level of sensuality, a middling property, the level of form, a refined property, the level of formlessness. Thus, there is the production of renewed becoming in the future. This is how there is becoming. Anguttara Nikaya, in 3.76. Like the earth property, monks, is how the four standing points for consciousness, the properties of form, feeling, perception, and fabrications should be seen. Like the liquid property is how delight and passion should be seen. Like the 5 types of plant propagation, roots, stems, joints, cuttings, and seeds, is how consciousness together with its nutriment should be seen. Samyutta Nikaya SN 22.54, Bija Sutta, means of propagation. What nourishes the cycle of rebirth according to the Buddha? To view consciousness and its nutriment here as a seed watered by craving, delight, and passion helps focus attention on the role played by these 3 latter mind states in producing food for endlessly repeated suffering and birth. These are the mind states that sustain the consciousness process as it moves from one standing point to another. Perhaps the Buddha switched from the feeding analogy to the seed analogy here because the implications of the food analogy at this point would have been too harsh to state explicitly in polite company. We keep feeding off the byproducts of our earlier feeding. The seed analogy, however, makes this point more indirectly. Just as seeds, when watered, grow into plants that both produce seeds and, when they die, add fertilizer to the soil that feeds those seeds, in the same way, consciousness nourished with karma and craving keeps producing more standing points. The aggregates of form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness for future acts of consciousness to feed on. Should consciousness, when standing, stand attached to form supported by form as its object, landing on form, watered with delight, it would exhibit growth, increase, and proliferation. Should consciousness, when standing, stand attached to feeling, supported by feeling, as its object, landing on feeling, watered with delight, it would exhibit growth, increase, and proliferation. Should consciousness, when standing, stand attached to perception, supported by perception, as its object, landing on perception, watered with delight, it would exhibit growth, increase, and proliferation. Should consciousness, when standing, stand attached to fabrications, supported by fabrications, as its object, landing on fabrications, watered with delight, it would exhibit growth, increase, and proliferation. Were someone to say, I will describe a coming, a going, a passing away, an arising, a growth, an increase, or a proliferation of consciousness apart from form, from feeling, from perception, from fabrications, that would be impossible. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 22.54. In other words, as long as delight and passion, this phrase is a synonym for clinging, nourishes the consciousness process. Consciousness in turn keeps creating the food to keep the process going indefinitely, even after the form of this body is cast aside. This is why repeated birth's process will not end until it's deprived of the water of craving and clinging. And the only way to deprive the process of its water and food is to develop dispassion for activities that sustain it. This is where this model for dependent co-arising shows its pragmatic value. It demonstrates not only that the food and water for rebirth can be directly experienced, but also that these processes are the direct consequence of choices made in the mind, the intentional activity of fabrication based on ignorance. In this way, it points to the possibility that the suffering of repeated rebirth can be ended by choice, choosing to develop appropriate attention, right view concerning the Four Noble Truths, which puts an end to craving and ignorance. That way, instead of getting entangled in trying to destroy the conditions of birth, which would lead to taking on a destroyer identity, which would merely continue the process of becoming, you choose simply to starve the process of its sustenance, allowing it to end on its own. That choice is where the path, the Fourth Noble Truth, begins.